It's my pleasure to introduce you two of the keynote speakers of this conference. In the first place, we'll talk David Bollier, author, activist, and consultant, co-founder of many commons initiatives, have worked a lot for many decades in the field of the commons. Is one of the most famous or mentioned in different words about the history of the commons, how the commons had evolved through the time and through the societies, and how the society enclosed many areas, reducing the space for the collaboration and the work with the public space, with the public goods, and with the public resources. One of the most mentioned book is, I can't remember the name, Thing Like the Commoner is the second one, I think. And now is, he received many prizes, many mentions in international conference. But today, the presentation of the David would be one part of the last book that would be appear in English after the summer, but it's already in German, or not yet, the book? In Germany. And the title is, I can't remember the title.
Free, Fair, and Alive.
Okay, Free, Fair, and Alive. So you have your time for the presentation.
Thank you so much, Benjamin. And I'd like to thank the sponsors for pulling this together. I've been so impressed that there's such a wide number of people who are studying the collaborative economy. It's a very much needed topic. To learn more about it far beyond just what the various industries have been studying. So today I'd like to talk about the commons from a slightly different perspective than usually discussed. And I think our challenge is to find ways to emancipate ourselves from some old ways of thinking. And that's been part of my own challenge to find new ways of talking about sharing and collaboration than maybe we have done historically. And so we unfortunately have to start very quickly by getting beyond the tragedy of the commons, which so many people still seem to think is the definition of the commons. The tragedy of the commons, of course, was first popularized in modern times by Garrett Hardin, the ecologist who wrote a famous 1968 essay, The Tragedy of the Commons, saying that if everyone were allowed to put their cattle on the shared pasture, nobody would have a rational incentive to hold back, and so too many cattle would overgraze the pasture, and it would be ruined, the tragedy of the commons. Well, this has become such a truism in economics and politics that many people regard the commons or shared management as inherently a failure. It just cannot succeed. And as a result, the commons is misunderstood or marginalized as something very minor or marginal compared to the state or market. And there's a lot of misunderstanding about the commons, which I hope we can clarify in my remarks. But let's just say that there are a lot of embedded political and personal prejudices in the very term, the tragedy of the commons. A friend of mine who's a scholar of the commons, Lewis Hyde, he described it as the tragedy of unmanaged, laissez-faire common pool resources with easy access for non-communicating, self-interested individuals. So there's a lot of premises built into the very idea of the overexploitation of the commons, because in fact, people can and do, for millennia, since time humans began, have found ways to work together for shared purpose. Now, in modern times, it was Elinor Ostrom, the great scholar of the commons, who won the Nobel Prize in 2009 for recovering this as a very rigorous scholar. That's her book, Governing the Commons, 1990, which helped clarify and identify the principles for successful commons. And I think it's notable that she was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize in economics because unlike her male counterparts, she was more sensitive to the role of relationships in economics as being economically meaningful. And I also like to think that in 2009, the year after the financial crisis, they wanted someone a little bit nicer and more humane than some of the conventional economists. Nonetheless, she has laid the groundwork for so much that has come since then, helping to point out that the commons is not just an unowned resource, it's a self-organized social system that consists of the community, the resource itself, and the social norms and protocols and rituals and traditions by which a community manages itself. So it's more than just sharing and cooperation, it's an enduring institutional form in which it has a greater degree of complexity and sophistication than simple sharing, which is of course important. But to give you I want to give a quick survey of commenting today, just to give you some examples and touch points to understand what I'm talking about when I talk about the commons. First of all, we should understand that there's an estimated 2 billion people or more whose everyday lives depend upon various natural resources managed as commons. We're talking about forests and fisheries and irrigation water and wild game and farmland. And conventional economists don't regard that as interesting because there's no money being exchanged very often. It's producing for household needs mostly, as opposed to producing for profit in the marketplace. So it's really kind of an overlooked and ignored aspect of the commons, yet it's still producing enormous benefit for humankind in arguably more ecologically friendly ways. But it's not just these kinds of global south countries where this is occurring. In a lot of the industrial north, in Europe, the US, there's a whole movement to reclaim local food sovereignty and develop systems for producing food in which there's greater local control, local self-determination, instead of these vast, expensive, carbon-rich transport chains to produce food. So I think this is a significant front of the commons. There's also the city as a commons, where there's all sorts of vehicles by which people are saying, we don't want our cities being controlled by outside investors or Airbnb that's hollowing out neighborhoods. We want greater control. And so the commons is a discourse or vehicle by which some people are exploring how this occurs. In Barcelona, for example, we have Wi-Fi-Net, the Wi-Fi system, run as a commons, which is really kind of a landmark pioneer in that regard. There's Open Commons Lints, which has free servers and email and government information all put online. So there's a lot of innovation going on in terms of the city as a commons. One aspect of that is alternative currencies, which the point is to have the value created within a community recirculated and captured instead of siphoned away by outside banks and investors. And this has many manifestations. I work with the Schumacher Center for New Economics, and we have the Berkshires in Western Massachusetts, which has been a very successful local currency. But the Bangla Pesa in Kenya, the Bristol Pound in UK, you know, Faircoin, and Ithaca Hours. So there's quite a lot of experimentation, including in digital currencies. I'll get to that in a few minutes. The web, of course, is a vast hosting infrastructure for commons. Despite all the attention that the corporate players and social media capture, really the web is most significant because it can be used as an easy, accessible, affordable infrastructure for people to comment. And we see this most prominently with open source software and the variety of things that have proliferated there, many of which are essential software systems for the internet. But we also see it in the whole range of Creative Commons licenses, which are now used in more than 170 legal jurisdictions around the world, which allows people to freely share their knowledge and images and music and all sorts of other things. They can legally share it in advance as copyright holders by putting these licenses on. It allows the freer circulation without payment or permission of lots of materials. It's a very significant achievement over the past 15 years. Now we're moving to new stages of sharing, something that's often called cosmo-local production, which builds on the open source software principles, is building physical things. FarmHack, for example, is building dozens of types of farm equipment based on open source principles where it's affordable, modular, locally sourceable, non-proprietary. Wikispeed Car is an actual vehicle, and there's other vehicles that are being built on the same principles through global design networks and engineers. Fab Labs are, of course, a major incubator of this type of innovation as well, where it's extremely shareable and lots of innovations emerge from it. Arduino, the Italian-based example of electronic circuit boards and other electronics that are shareable, is another example. So there is really a large sector of the economy that is starting to expand in these directions. One of the more interesting and exciting aspects of this is network-based cooperation, where new protocols, I suppose most famously embodied by the blockchain, which is associated with Bitcoin, but there's also others such as the holochain, and a colleague of mine, Stacco Troncoso, will be talking about distributed cooperative organizations, or DISCO, as another type of model. These are all on the cusp of exploding, but offer enormous potential for network-based collaboration and sharing. And the truth of the matter is that commons can basically arise anywhere. I've, in my travels, encountered, for example, HowlRound, a theater commons, which brings together non-commercial and regional theater in the United States as a sharing enterprise. There's the humanitarian OpenStreetMap team that does instant maps for first responders after earthquakes and other natural disasters. There's the open source seed initiative that's trying to fight the major ag biotech companies by ensuring that seeds are shareable among farmers and not all just controlled by an oligopoly of seed corporations. I mentioned Guifinet, the potato park in Peru, an agroecological system by which the indigenous people control the enormous biodiversity of potatoes in that region. And this is really, I think, a model for how certain genetic information can be managed as a commons. So I just wanted to give you a sense of the breadth and depth of commons out there. But I started by saying we need to think differently. That will be the focus of the rest of my remarks here. And I often call this about making an onto shift to the commons, meaning an ontological shift, understanding the different nature of being and social relations that are embodied when we talk about a commons, which is very different from the one that standard economics puts forward of based on the individual and market transactions and the earth as an object. We're talking about something different with the commons. Now, as you may have, the examples suggest, commoning is not a tragedy, it's generative. It creates value every bit as significantly as the market. It's just arguably not seen as much because it's not embodied in money when transferred through massive financial systems. But it has a different operational logic and ethos than both the market as well as a lot of standard organizations, meaning the internal governance of how a commons is run. A commons is about practical, bottom-up experimentation, and it's not an ideological construct, even though it does, of course, have political implications in how it works. But it's really about relationships and social practice, not price, being the driver for how things get created and how needs are satisfied in the way the title of my book, which I'll get to in a minute, is called Free, Fair, and Alive. Those are some core ideas, I think, in how a commons functions. And this is embodied in the quote by the historian of the commons, Peter Linebaugh, who says, "There is no commons without commoning," meaning the commons is a verb. It's something we do. It's a set of social practices. It's not just a thing, the way economists would say, oh, that's an unowned resource, that's a commons. I find that a very archaic and actually incorrect notion of the commons. More broadly, the commons is really about a different universe of value than standard economics. These are some of the values that commons strive to embody and often do quite well. in yoking responsibility with entitlements to people. And fairness and long-term stewardship are very important aspects of it. It's about meeting basic needs first, as opposed to profit or something that's not really necessary. It's about inalienability, meaning it's not necessarily for sale or only under careful conditions, so that it's not really, the commons is not really a creature of the market. So it's also about decommodifying our reliance on markets so that we're not as dependent upon global, extractive, volatile markets for our everyday lives. And of course, about bottom-up rulemaking in which we have a role in making the rules that govern us, which we then inscribe in tradition and custom as a long-term way of sustaining it. Now, I want to talk a moment about the tyranny of old worldviews, because I think that we're in the midst of some old worldviews that need to be shed. And in the course of researching my book, I came across the example of a prominent geologist in the 1840s, Edward Hitchcock, who found these footprints in sandstone, and he was trying to make sense of them. And because he was of a biblical worldview, he said they had to be flying birds, the footprints of flying birds. And you have to understand that Darwin hadn't written Origin of the Species yet. The word dinosaur had not even been invented. So in some ways it made perfect sense. But we, of course, have come to realize that the Darwinian explanations had far more explanatory power and helped open up a whole new field of inquiry that is based more on the evidence than the prior perspectives. And this is part of our challenge in thinking about the commons. Let me see if this is, I want to show this interesting short video here. Let's see if I can get this right. No, it's not coming up on the screen. Okay, well, I'll not show that. For those of you who may have seen Paul Hughes, he has these perspectival paintings. When you walk from one side to another, the perspective changes radically because of how he's constructed it. And I think this is part of our challenge. We don't even realize how much we've internalized many of our perspectives that we need to sort of get beyond. And that's what I see as one of the key challenges in the commons today. But let me just keep going. I think that in some ways we're starting to realize that the market capitalism is an archaic perspective that is not explaining as much, is not meeting needs as much. The idea of value being equivalent to price and money, the idea of progress being achieved through commodification and privatization, and the idea of free trade simply being emancipatory when in fact it's often about extraction and dispossession. This is a perspective we need to move beyond. And we see the problems of it, the way global capital becomes a source of enclosure of the commons, meaning the privatization and commodification of our shared wealth. And I think this is a natural thing for capital to do because it sees the commons as free or discounted, subsidized resources that it can simply appropriate. That's one of our challenges as commoners. And just to give you a quick idea of how far enclosure goes, of course, today there's a great international land grab going on with sovereign investment funds and hedge funds and others gobbling up land in Africa and Asia and Latin America, which had historically been controlled by traditional communities or indigenous peoples. And it's basically replaying the English enclosure movement of a few centuries ago by dispossessing people, moving them into cities, and turning them into wage slaves. 20% of the human genome is currently privately owned under patents. Another example of how our shared wealth is being privatized. And this is a story unto itself, but there are countless other enclosures we could talk about. I'd just like to say, though, that enclosure is not just about economic dispossession. It's really something that diminishes our social life in our internal life. And I've struggled with how to maybe illustrate this. And this is a map of the Great Sandy Desert, the way we moderns look at it. But contrast this with the way the Aborigines in Australia look at it. That's their same map of the same territory. And it's really suggests the emotional connection that they have. This is really kind of a work of art but I want to suggest that the commons gives space for all sorts of different emotional views and perspectives and lives that the market world often does not. So it's worth talking about the commons as something that's world-making and not simply as an economic enterprise. World-making not just for exotic cultures, but for ourselves, whether we're in digital spaces or in our own communities. We're making worlds. And commoning means learning to see relationality and value as living phenomena. So that's a shift in perspective. And to do that, to shift our perspective, that means we sometimes have to shed words that are difficult. In modern economics, we often regard individuals as isolated, ahistorical, disconnected. In the commons, I like to talk about them as the nested I, because we're nested within these larger communities. And instead of talking about resources as if there's something separate from us, many resources are really should be regarded as care wealth, something that I have an emotional, cultural affection for, and I want to protect it therefore, and so on. So it's these kinds of shifts that we need to be mindful of. So in my book, Free, Fair, and Alive, which I wrote with my colleague, German activist, scholar Silke Helfrich, which the German edition came out in April and the English edition in September, and Spanish and French editions are in the works. In this book, we try to identify what we regard as patterns of commoning, things that recur. And we take a cue, our methodology is from Christopher Alexander, who is a famous iconoclastic urban designer and architect, who said, why are certain designs or patterns in buildings and urban spaces so recurrent over centuries, across cultures? And his answer was, they serve certain basic needs in profound ways, often in a spiritual way. And these patterns are not identical because they each have the situational realities of their time and place and geography reflected in them, but there are certain regularities. So that's a really interesting way to show that there are commonalities among things while also situational differences. And we took that methodology to develop what we call the triad of commoning, which consists of the social life, the peer governance, and the provisioning of commons, all of which are interrelated but can be seen from a different prism. So in modern society, we might separate civil society from government, from the economy, but in a commons, as you can see, they're more integrated. And those are some of the patterns that are embodied. It's not as if all patterns are in all commons, but they tend to recur in many of them. So for example, in the social life of commoning, these are some of the patterns that we tend to see played out. And I will not go through them all, but I just want to give you a sense of some of the patterns that are evident. And for peer governance as well, bringing diversity into shared purpose, assuring commoners' consent and decision-making, ensuring transparency in a sphere of trust, and so on. And then there's certain important aspects of dealing with the money and markets, so that the integrity of the commons is protected despite dealing with the logic of the market. Provisioning as well, different things that we go through. Now, as I mentioned, coming to understand the commons as a living system, I think requires us to shed some vocabularies and concepts that are not exactly incorrect, but not exactly right either. I mentioned resources, the idea of development as market growth, the idea of leaders, when that implies followers as opposed to everybody being a leader of some sort. These are the kinds of ideas that I've become more self-aware of as I've gotten into the commons. And I've also become more aware that we need to learn more appropriate terms for commoning, some of which we've had to invent. Instead of homo economicus, as economists will say that we're all rational, utility maximizing, materialistic individuals, the idea of Ubuntu rationality, meaning I am because we are, that there's an alignment between the collective and the individual, that's what a commons aspires to and often enacts. Instead of hierarchy, which has strict division of jobs and roles, We can have a heterarchy, which is a more horizontal and flexible way of organizing activities. Relationalized property is a way we can think about property not as individual dominion and exclusive control, but something that can be socially managed and controlled in ways that are more socially minded, and so on. So this is, I think, the challenge we have in truly understanding the commons. Now, I'm frequently asked, well, how do we scale the commons, especially with so many things like climate change bearing down on us? I think the short answer is we need to emulate and federate, meaning we keep the commons at the appropriate scale, but we have federations among them, and that can reach a larger footprint without becoming this large, singular, unified institution, but instead many, many small institutions of appropriate scale. Combined with this, the state has a role in, and commoners themselves, in developing infrastructures that support commoning, as well as state engaging into commons public partnerships instead of simply private public partnerships, which are often simply rip-offs of the public treasury. This saying by Thomas Lomé, a Dutch artist, sort of resonated with me. The next big thing will be a lot of small things. The challenge is to find the connective tissue, the synergy between those small things, which are often very similar. They share shared purposes, but they need to remain smaller things to have the integrity of purpose and development. So I think that's a different pattern, too, from one large dictatorial organization saying things. Another frequent objection is, well, what about state power? What's its role? And indeed, that is a challenge because the state is so allied with markets and capital that it's not often, the state is often not friendly to commons. But I like this quote from Hannah Arendt, the philosopher, who said that power springs up between people when they act together and they vanish the moment they disperse. Meaning, when people come together as a commons, they create a form of certainly cultural power, but also a form of political power, which, if federated, has its own potency against some of the problems with the state today. So I think the commons has this potential, even though it's not, by definition, an ideological or political body. We see this, I think, in the rise of transnational movements that are enacting the commons. And these are, I'm listing some that in various ways with varying degrees of awareness of the commons itself are enacting some of those principles. And I think that this represents the cutting edge of a new type of political economy if allowed to mature, if developed more transnationally, if they observe some of the fundamental principles of the commons. So in short and in conclusion, I think commoning will help define the future of cooperation and sharing, which itself will take many, many different forms. But I think it has a very emancipatory potential, and we already see this in countless projects around the world. So with that, thank you.